My name is Bella. I was 30 years old when I walked into my father's birthday party leaning on a crutch and already knowing how the night would go. Not because I could see the future, but because I knew my family. The living room was full. Balloons, food, voices overlapping each other. People laughing, hugging, pretending everything was exactly the way it should be. I moved carefully through the space, slower than everyone else, the rubber tip of my crutch tapping softly against the floor. A few people noticed, most didn't. The ones who did gave me the same look I'd grown used to over the past year, something between pity and doubt. The kind of look that asks a silent question: is it really that bad? I'd stopped answering that question a long time ago. My injury wasn't new. I'd been using a crutch since the accident, going through physical therapy, appointments, scans. The doctors were clear. The damage was permanent. I would improve, but I would never fully recover. My family, however, preferred a different version of the story. In their version, I was exaggerating, being dramatic, holding on to the injury longer than necessary because it was convenient, because it got me attention, because it gave me an excuse. No one said it outright anymore. They didn't have to. It lived in the jokes, the sighs, the way conversations went quiet when I mentioned pain. My sister was already there when I arrived, standing near the table, holding court, confident, loud, comfortable in a way I never was anymore. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Still using that thing?" she said lightly, nodding at my crutch. I smiled back, the way I always did. "Yeah." She rolled her eyes, but said nothing else. The party went on. People toasted my dad. Someone cut the cake. Music played softly in the background. From the outside, it was a normal family celebration. But underneath it, something was tightening. Because the truth about my injury had always been inconvenient. And tonight, whether I knew it yet or not, it was about to stop being ignored. The moment didn't explode all at once. It started small, the way humiliations usually do in families like mine, disguised as humor, slipped into conversation when enough people were around to make resistance awkward. My sister had been drinking, not enough to slur her words, but enough to loosen her restraint. She laughed louder than usual, talked over people, and kept circling back to me whenever the attention drifted away from her. Every time someone asked how I was doing, she answered for me. "She's fine," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Better than she lets on." I didn't argue. I never did. Arguing only made it worse. In her mind, any defense was proof that I enjoyed the attention. At some point, my father asked everyone to gather for a group photo. Chairs were pulled closer, people squeezed together. I shifted carefully, adjusting my weight, positioning my crutch so I wouldn't lose balance. That was when she sighed loudly. "Do you really need that right now?" she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the chatter. The room went quiet enough that I could feel it before I registered it. I looked at her, confused. "Yeah," I said calmly. "I do." She laughed, shaking her head like I'd just told a bad joke. "Come on, it's been long enough. You're milking it." A few people chuckled, uncertain whether they were supposed to agree. No one spoke up. I felt my face heat, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm not pretending." That was when she stepped closer. She reached out and grabbed my crutch. Not gently, not playfully. She yanked it out of my hand. The sudden loss of support hit my body before my mind caught up. My leg buckled. I stumbled forward, instinctively reaching for something to steady myself. But there was nothing there. I went down hard. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone dropped a glass. I heard my name, but it felt distant, muffled by the rush of pain and shock flooding my senses. My sister stood there holding my crutch, eyes wide, not with concern, but with disbelief that I had actually fallen. "See?" she said, her voice sharper now, defensive. "If you were really injured, that wouldn't have happened. You're just faking it for sympathy." The words hung in the air, ugly and exposed. I was still on the floor, one knee throbbing, my palms burning where I'd caught myself. My heart was racing, not just from the fall, but from the realization that she hadn't grabbed the crutch by accident. She'd meant to do it. People rushed forward then. Someone helped me sit up. Someone else picked up the crutch from where she'd dropped it. My father looked stunned, frozen between his daughters like he didn't know which version of reality to choose. "What is wrong with you?" someone asked her quietly. She crossed her arms, doubling down instead of backing off. "I'm just tired of the act," she said. "It's embarrassing. She's turning everything into a performance." I looked around the room, waiting, again, for someone to say enough. No one did. There were murmurs, awkward shifting. A few people avoided eye contact altogether. The silence wasn't neutral, it was complicit. I forced myself to stand with help, ignoring the pain pulsing through my leg. My hands were shaking, but my voice wasn't. "I didn't fake anything," I said. "And you know that." She scoffed. "Doctors say a lot of things. You took one opinion and ran with it." That sentence landed harder than the fall, because she wasn't just accusing me of lying. She was rewriting what had happened. The accident, the months of appointments, the scans, the therapy. All of it reduced to exaggeration because it was inconvenient to her. I realized then that this wasn't about skepticism. It was about control. If my injury wasn't real, she didn't have to feel responsible. If I was pretending, she didn't have to face what she'd done. The party didn't resume after that. People stood in uncomfortable clusters, whispering. My father tried to redirect the evening, but the air had changed. The laughter was gone. I sat there, holding my crutch again, my body aching, my dignity scraped raw in front of everyone I was supposed to feel safe around. And for the first time that night, I stopped wondering if the truth would ever come out. Because I suddenly understood something very clearly. This wasn't over, and whether my sister liked it or not, she had just forced the story into the open, sitting there after the fall, with my crutch back in my hand and every eye in the room either on me or carefully avoiding me. I realized something that hurt more than my leg. None of this was new. My sister's accusation didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for months, quietly, the same way my injury had been slowly rewritten into something more convenient for everyone else. The accident itself had happened almost a year earlier. We were at my parents' house, rushing to get things ready before guests arrived for a small gathering. My sister had been in charge of rearranging some heavy furniture in the living room. She insisted she could handle it herself. When I offered to help or suggested waiting until someone else got there, she brushed me off. "I've got it," she said. "Stop being dramatic." I remember hearing a loud scrape, then a sharp crack. One of the supports under a shelving unit gave way. I didn't have time to move before it shifted toward me. I tried to step back, but my foot caught, and all my weight twisted the wrong way as I went down. The pain was immediate, blinding. I couldn't stand. I couldn't even breathe properly for a moment. My sister stood frozen, staring at me, her face pale. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then she kept repeating, "You're okay. You're okay." Like saying it out loud would make it true. I wasn't okay. At the hospital later that night, the doctors were careful with their words. Severe damage, nerve involvement, a long recovery. They asked questions about how it happened, about the setup, about whether safety precautions had been followed. My sister answered most of them before I could. She said it was a freak accident. She said everything had been stable. She said no one could have predicted it. At the time, I was in too much pain to argue. In the weeks that followed, The story solidified. It became easier for everyone to accept that it had just been bad luck. My parents leaned into that version immediately. Accidents happen. No one's fault. Let's not dwell on it. And slowly, quietly, the tone shifted. At first, they were sympathetic. They helped me around the house. They asked about appointments. They listened when I talked about pain. But as months passed and I didn't bounce back the way they expected, patience thinned. Physical therapy appointments piled up. Progress was slow. Some days were worse than others. The word permanent started appearing in medical conversations, and that made everyone uncomfortable. It was easier to believe I was exaggerating than to accept that this wasn't going away. My sister leaned into that discomfort. She joked about how long I'd been using the crutch. She told people I was attached to it. She rolled her eyes whenever I mentioned pain. And every time a doctor adjusted my treatment plan or mentioned lasting damage, she dismissed it as doctors being overly cautious. Doctors love worst-case scenarios, she said more than once. That's how they cover themselves. No one challenged her. By the time we reached my dad's birthday, the narrative had fully flipped. I wasn't the injured one anymore. I was the difficult one. The one who wouldn't move on. The one who made everyone else feel guilty by still being hurt. Sitting there on the floor, replaying all of that in my head, I understood exactly why she'd grabbed my crutch. If I fell, she could prove her version of the story. If I didn't, she'd expose me as a fraud. Either way, she thought she'd win. What she hadn't accounted for was the truth she'd been avoiding since the night of the accident, the questions she'd answered too quickly, the details she'd glossed over, the warnings she'd ignored when she insisted everything was fine, because the truth was never unclear. It was just inconvenient. And in that living room, with everyone watching and the air still heavy from what she'd done, the only reason the truth hadn't surfaced yet was because no one had forced it to. But that was about to change, because the one person who knew exactly what had caused my injury, the one person who had no emotional reason to soften the story, had just arrived at the party. And my sister didn't see them walk in. I didn't notice him at first. Most of my attention was still focused on keeping myself upright, on ignoring the dull ache spreading through my leg and the sharper sting of what had just happened in front of everyone. Voices blended together around me, concerned murmurs, awkward attempts to change the subject. Someone asking if I needed ice. Then I heard a familiar voice say my name. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough to cut through the noise. Hannah? I looked up. He was standing near the doorway, holding a small gift bag. His expression shifting from polite confusion to something more serious the moment he saw me sitting there with my crutch, surrounded by tense faces. It took my brain a second to catch up. It was my doctor. Not just any doctor, but the orthopedic specialist who had been overseeing my case for months. The one who'd reviewed every scan, every test, every failed attempt to regain full function. The one who had sat across from me and said, carefully and clearly, "This damage is permanent." He was a colleague of my dad's friend, someone my parents had invited without thinking twice about the timing. To them, he was just another guest. To me, he was the one person in that room who knew the full story and had no reason to protect anyone's version of it. The room went quiet again as he stepped closer. "What happened?" he asked, his tone calm but alert, the way doctors sound when something doesn't add up. Before I could answer, my sister spoke. "She tripped," she said quickly. "She's fine. She's just being dramatic again." The word landed hard. He looked at her, then back at me, his eyes dropping briefly to my crutch, to the way I was holding my leg. His expression tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. "That doesn't look like a minor fall," he said evenly. My father cleared his throat. "It was just a misunderstanding," he said. "Things got a little heated." The doctor nodded once, then crouched slightly to be closer to my eye level. "Are you hurt?" "A little," I said. "But it's not new." He exhaled slowly, like he already knew that answer. Someone offered him a drink. Someone else tried to lighten the mood with a joke. He ignored both, his attention still on me. "I wasn't expecting to see you here," he said gently. "How have you been managing?" Before I could respond, my sister laughed. A short, sharp sound. "She's been milking it," she said. "You know how she is. She still claims she can't walk properly because of that accident." The doctor straightened. "Claims," he repeated. The shift in the room was subtle but immediate. People stopped fidgeting. Conversations died off completely. Everyone sensed that something important had just been said, even if they didn't yet understand what. He turned fully toward her now. "You're referring to the injury from last year?" "Yes," she said, her confidence wavering just slightly. "But that was blown way out of proportion." He paused, choosing his words with professional care. "That injury resulted in permanent nerve and structural damage," he said. "There was nothing exaggerated about it." Silence. I could hear someone inhale sharply behind me. My sister blinked. "That's not what you said before," she replied. "You said recovery was possible. Improvement was possible." He corrected calmly. "Full recovery was not." And that was made clear. My mother shifted uncomfortably. "We were told it was just bad luck," she said. "An accident." The doctor nodded slowly. "It was an accident," he agreed. "But not an unavoidable one." The air in the room felt heavy now, thick with something no one wanted to name. He looked around, clearly realizing he had walked into the middle of something much bigger than a birthday party. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing at me. "I didn't mean to intrude, but I think there may be some misunderstandings here." My sister crossed her arms, defensive. "Are you saying this is my fault?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he said, "I'm saying the cause of the injury was preventable, and that was documented." That was the moment. The moment when the story my family had been telling themselves, the convenient version, started to crack. No one interrupted him. No one laughed. No one tried to brush it off. Because the one thing my sister had relied on all along was being believed. And for the first time, that certainty was slipping. The doctor didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone or point a finger. That was what made his words impossible to ignore. He spoke the way professionals do when they know facts matter more than emotion. "I want to be very clear," he said, his tone steady. "What happened to Hannah wasn't a mystery. We investigated the cause thoroughly." My sister let out a short laugh that sounded more like a reflex than confidence. "You're talking like this was negligence," she said. "It was just furniture. Things break." The doctor nodded slightly. "Things break when they're improperly supported," he replied, "or when safety warnings are ignored." That word, ignored, settled heavily in the room. He explained it calmly, piece by piece, the way he likely had in medical reports and consultations. But this time there was no buffer of paperwork or closed doors. Everyone heard it. The shelving unit had been unstable. It required reinforcement before being moved. Warnings had been given. He looked directly at my sister. "You were advised not to reposition it alone." Her face drained of color. "That's not," she started. "You insisted," he continued, not unkindly, but firmly. And when it shifted, Hannah took the full force of the fall. The twisting motion caused severe damage to the joint and surrounding nerves. My father sat down heavily in the nearest chair. The doctor went on, explaining the injury in plain terms, the kind that couldn't be brushed off as exaggeration or pessimism, the kind that didn't need interpretation. "There was immediate trauma," he said, "and delayed intervention worsened the outcome." That part made my mother gasp softly. "What do you mean?" she asked. He hesitated, then answered honestly. "She should not have been moved the way she was. She needed stabilization and imaging sooner. Delays increase the risk of permanent damage in cases like this. No one spoke. My sister stared at the floor now, her arms no longer crossed, her confidence completely gone. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought she was just in shock." "You were told to call for help," he replied. "Instead, you reassured her she was fine." That sentence felt like a line drawn in ink. For months, my pain had been questioned, my recovery doubted, my integrity quietly eroded by suggestions that I was exaggerating or holding on to something that should have healed. And now, in less than 5 minutes, all of that had been undone by facts. Not by my emotions, not by my insistence, by the truth. My sister shook her head slowly. "I never meant for this to happen," she said, her voice small. "I didn't think—" "No one thinks permanent damage will happen," the doctor said. "But that doesn't change responsibility." The word hung there, heavy and undeniable. I watched my parents process this in real time. The confusion, the guilt, the realization that the version they had chosen to believe, the easier one, had come at a cost. My mother looked at me, her eyes wet. "Why didn't you tell us it was this serious?" I swallowed. "I did." She flinched. The doctor straightened, clearly aware that his presence had shifted the entire room. "I'm sorry this conversation is happening like this," he said quietly, "but it's important that the reality is understood." My sister finally looked up at me. For the first time since the accident, there was no accusation in her eyes, no defensiveness, just fear, and something else. Recognition. She saw it then. Not the inconvenience, not the embarrassment, but the permanence. The way my life had been altered in a way that couldn't be undone. The room stayed silent, not awkwardly this time, but reverently. Like everyone understood they were standing at the point of no return. The truth had been spoken, and there was no pretending anymore. No one told my sister to apologize. That was the part that surprised me the most. After the doctor finished speaking, there was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices demanding accountability. No one needed to. The room itself had shifted. The version of events she'd relied on for nearly a year had collapsed, and everyone could see it. She stood there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by people who now knew the truth, with nowhere to redirect the blame. My father was the first to speak, but his voice was quiet, almost stunned. "Is this true?" he asked her. Not accusing, just asking. She didn't answer right away. For the first time, she didn't rush to fill the silence. Her eyes moved from my father to my mother, then to the guests who were pretending not to stare while doing exactly that. People she'd laughed with earlier, people who'd watched her grab my crutch and accuse me of faking it. The weight of that moment settled on her slowly. "I didn't think it would be permanent," she said finally. "I really didn't." The doctor nodded slightly. "Most people don't," he said. "That doesn't change what happened." My mother covered her mouth, tears spilling freely now. "All this time," she whispered, looking at me. "We thought—" "I know what you thought," I said quietly. It wasn't anger in my voice, it was exhaustion. My sister took a step toward me, then stopped, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. Her face was pale, her confidence completely gone. "I shouldn't have said those things," she said, her words uneven. "I shouldn't have grabbed your crutch. That was wrong." She hesitated, swallowing hard. "I'm sorry." The word hung in the air. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was public. And that mattered more than she realized. For months, she'd controlled the story by saying just enough, by casting doubt without ever having to prove anything. Now, in front of everyone who had once laughed along or stayed silent, she was admitting fault. Not just for what she'd said tonight, for everything. "I was scared," she continued, her voice cracking. "If I admitted I messed up, I'd have to live with it. So I convinced myself you were exaggerating. I told myself it wasn't that bad. I nodded slowly. I know. The room stayed quiet. No one interrupted. No one rushed to comfort her or smooth things over. For once, the discomfort wasn't mine to carry. She looked directly at me then, her eyes filling. "I'm sorry I hurt you," she said. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you were lying when you weren't." I didn't respond right away. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because apologies don't erase damage. They don't rewind time or undo altered bodies. They don't restore trust instantly, no matter how sincere they sound. But they do something else. They stop the lie. "I accept your apology," I said finally. "But that doesn't mean everything goes back to how it was." She nodded, like she already knew that. Around us, people shifted uncomfortably. A few guests quietly excused themselves. My father rubbed his face with both hands, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The party never resumed after that. No cake, no music, no forced laughter. People left in small groups, murmuring subdued goodbyes. The celebration effectively over. As the room emptied, my sister sat down heavily on the couch, staring at the floor. My parents hovered near me, unsure what to say, unsure how to make up for months of disbelief. There was nothing they could say, but something important had happened. For the first time since the accident, the truth had been spoken out loud, acknowledged by the one person who had spent the most time denying it. And for the first time, the silence that followed didn't feel like dismissal. It felt like accountability. The house felt different once everyone left. Not quieter, just heavier. Like the walls themselves were holding on to what had been said. The balloons were still up. Half-cut cake sat untouched on the table. A birthday banner drooped slightly on one side. Forgotten. Nothing had been officially ended, but the celebration was clearly over. I stayed seated for a while, my crutch resting against my leg, listening to the sounds of my parents cleaning up in silence. Plates clinked softly. A trash bag rustled. No one spoke, as if words might disturb something fragile that had finally settled into place. Eventually, my father came and sat across from me. "I didn't want to believe it," he said quietly. "Not because I thought you were lying, because believing you meant accepting that we failed you." I nodded. I know. That was the part people rarely admit. That disbelief is often more about self-protection than cruelty. My mother joined us, her eyes red and tired. She apologized. Not with excuses this time, but with a simple acknowledgement. She said she should have listened sooner, that she should have asked harder questions instead of accepting the version of events that felt easier. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to reassure her. Because accountability doesn't need to be softened to be real. My sister didn't come back into the room right away. When she did, she stood near the doorway, uncertain, like she wasn't sure she still belonged in the same space. "I know an apology doesn't fix this," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me." I looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know what forgiveness looks like yet," I said honestly. "But I'm done pretending this didn't change my life." She nodded, tears slipping down her face, and for the first time, she didn't argue. She didn't deflect. She didn't try to reframe it. She accepted it. That mattered more than any dramatic gesture could have. In the days that followed, the story shifted, not because I retold it, but because it couldn't be avoided anymore. Relatives called, awkward and careful, apologizing for jokes they'd laughed at or doubts they'd quietly held. Some conversations were uncomfortable. Others were brief. Not everyone handled it well, but the narrative had changed. I noticed it in small ways. People stopped questioning my pain. They stopped suggesting I try harder or push through. My crutch stopped being treated like a prop and started being treated like what it was, a necessity. And something else changed too. I stopped feeling the need to explain myself. I didn't justify doctor appointments. I didn't soften descriptions of bad days. I didn't downplay limitations to make others comfortable. The truth had been spoken once, clearly, in a room full of witnesses. I didn't need to keep proving it. My relationship with my sister didn't magically heal. Some things remained awkward. Some trust didn't return. But there was a boundary now, clear and visible, that hadn't existed before. She no longer joked about my injury. She didn't roll her eyes or dismiss my pain. When she spoke to me, she chose her words carefully, not out of fear, out of understanding. As for me, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. The accident had changed my body in ways I would carry forever. That hadn't changed. But something else had been repaired. The part of me that had spent months wondering if I was imagining my own reality. I wasn't. I never had been. At my father's next birthday, the house was quieter, smaller, more honest. No one made jokes at anyone else's expense. No one tested boundaries they didn't understand. And when I walked in with my crutch, no one stared. They simply made space. That was the moment I understood something important. I hadn't needed to scream to be believed. I hadn't needed to expose anyone. I hadn't needed revenge. The truth had stood up on its own, and once it did, it stayed standing.